Kimi Antonelli just shocked Formula One. A 19-year-old rookie just took pole position at the Chinese Grand Prix. 1 minute, 32 seconds. The fastest lap of the entire weekend. The youngest pole sitter in the history of the sport. But that is not the moment that made the paddock go silent. Because seconds later, Max Verstappen looked at the data from that lap. And what he noticed immediately raised a terrifying question for the rest of Formula One. Is the Mercedes already too fast for everyone else? Here is the number that stunned the entire grid. Verstappen finished qualifying in 8th place. More than 1.5 seconds slower than Antonelli's pole lap. In modern Formula One, that gap is enormous. A gap like that usually means only one thing. One team has understood the new regulations better than everyone else. And when engineers compared Verstappen's onboard with Antonelli's lap, the difference looked almost unreal. The Mercedes keeps accelerating down the Shanghai straight, while the Red Bull simply cannot. More speed, more energy deployment, more stability through the corners. And suddenly the entire paddock started asking a dangerous question. Did Mercedes just unlock the secret of the 2026 regulations? Because if the data from that lap is telling the truth, then what Max Verstappen just revealed after qualifying might change the entire championship. Now, to understand why Verstappen's reaction after qualifying became such a big talking point, we need to go back to the beginning of the session in Shanghai. Because the Chinese Grand Prix is not just another circuit on the calendar. Shanghai exposes everything. Long corners that punish instability. Heavy braking zones that reveal balance problems. And one of the longest straights in Formula One. If a car has a weakness, this track will find it immediately. That is why engineers from every team were watching this qualifying session very carefully. Australia had already suggested something important. Mercedes looked strong. Very strong. George Russell had dominated the opening race of the season. But some teams believed that performance might have been track-specific. Melbourne can hide weaknesses. Shanghai cannot. And the moment qualifying began, the Mercedes looked frighteningly comfortable. Both Russell and Antonelli were fast immediately. Smooth steering inputs. Stable braking zones. Clean acceleration out of corners. Everything about the W17 looked controlled. But the real difference appeared when the cars reached the massive straight at the end of the lap. This is where engineers started noticing something unusual. The Mercedes did not just accelerate hard. It kept accelerating much longer than the other cars. Most cars reach a point on the straight where electrical deployment begins to fade. The energy system starts running out. Acceleration flattens. But the Mercedes kept pulling. Meter after meter. And that difference becomes devastating over a full lap. This is exactly what we saw in Antonelli's pole lap. He matched Russell through the first sectors. Then in the final sector, the car simply unleashed its full potential. Perfect traction out of the final corner. Full energy deployment. And the stopwatch confirmed what the data had already suggested. 1 minute, 32 seconds. Pole position. The youngest pole sitter in Formula One history. But while Mercedes was celebrating, the mood inside the Red Bull garage was completely different. Because when Max Verstappen finished his final lap, he immediately knew something was wrong. The RB22 simply did not behave the way he expected. Through several corners the rear felt unstable. Entering the corner the car felt nervous. Mid-corner it felt disconnected. And on exit, the traction simply was not there. Those three problems together create the worst possible situation for a Formula One driver. Because the driver never fully trusts the car. And without that confidence, extracting the final tenths becomes almost impossible. That is exactly what Verstappen described during the weekend. At several points he said the car felt almost impossible to drive. That statement alone shocked many people in the paddock. Because Verstappen is famous for controlling extremely aggressive cars. If he says the car is difficult, the problem is serious. But the real shock came when the final classification appeared on the timing screens. Antonelli on pole. Russell second. Ferrari directly behind. And the Red Bulls, only 8th and 9th. Verstappen 8th. Hadjar 9th. Both more than 1.5 seconds slower than the Mercedes. In modern Formula One, that gap is enormous. Especially for a team that dominated the sport not long ago. And when engineers began comparing the telemetry between Antonelli's lap and Verstappen's lap, the pattern became very clear. The RB22 is losing time almost everywhere. Entry. Mid-corner. Corner exit. But the most painful losses appear in the final sector of the track. The sequence that leads onto the enormous Shanghai straight. This is where the Red Bull struggles with traction and balance. And when the car finally reaches the straight, another problem appears. The energy deployment. Several radio messages from Verstappen during the weekend pointed to inconsistent hybrid delivery. Small interruptions in the power deployment that cost precious tenths on the straight. And under the new regulations, that kind of inconsistency can destroy an entire lap. Because energy management now defines performance in 2026. Every team must carefully harvest energy under braking, and release it efficiently on the straights. If that cycle works perfectly, the car becomes extremely fast. But if the system behaves inconsistently, the driver loses time without even understanding why. Which may explain the frustration we saw from Verstappen after qualifying. Because when he compared his data to Antonelli's pole lap, the difference was impossible to ignore. The Mercedes was not just faster. It was operating with far greater efficiency. And that is exactly the kind of advantage that can define an entire Formula One season. But here is where things become even more interesting. Because the gap between Mercedes and Red Bull might not only be about the car. It might also reveal something about how each team interpreted the new regulations. And that difference could explain why one team is dominating the front row, while the other is suddenly fighting just to stay in the top 10. But the deeper engineers looked into the data from qualifying, the more uncomfortable the picture became for Red Bull. Because this is not just a case of one team being slightly faster. This looks like two completely different interpretations of the new regulations. And right now, Mercedes appears to have chosen the correct path. Under the 2026 rules, the biggest challenge for every team is energy management. The power units are no longer just about raw engine power. They are about efficiency. How much electrical energy you recover under braking. How smoothly you deploy that energy on the straight. And how stable the car remains while doing both. Mercedes seems to have solved that puzzle earlier than everyone else. The W17 allows the driver to brake very deep into the corner. That longer braking phase generates more energy recovery. More recovered energy means more power available later in the lap. Which explains why the Mercedes keeps accelerating when other cars begin to lose deployment. The difference becomes obvious on the Shanghai straight. Antonelli exits the final corner cleanly. The car launches forward. At first the gap to the cars behind looks small. But halfway down the straight, the Mercedes keeps gaining speed. The acceleration stays strong. Smooth. Relentless. Meanwhile the Red Bull begins to flatten out. The energy deployment fades earlier. And suddenly the Mercedes is pulling away meter by meter. That pattern appeared again and again during qualifying. And it is exactly what Verstappen noticed when he compared his lap with Antonelli's. Because the RB22 does not only struggle with balance, it also appears to have an inconsistent hybrid system. During several laps this weekend, Verstappen reported small interruptions in the power delivery. Tiny drops in deployment that cost 3 or 4 tenths on the back straight alone. Those moments may seem small, but in modern Formula One, they are devastating. Especially on a circuit like Shanghai where the straight is so long. And that is why Verstappen's frustration after qualifying was impossible to hide. Because this problem is not something a driver can solve with skill. If the energy deployment is unstable, the driver is simply a passenger. And that realization may explain the tone of his comments throughout the weekend. At several moments he described the car as unpredictable, unstable on entry, floating through the middle of the corner, and weak on traction at the exit. Those three characteristics together create a car that never feels connected to the driver, which makes pushing to the limit almost impossible. And that is exactly why the RB22 struggles so much in qualifying. The car might show flashes of speed in individual corners, but across an entire lap, the performance never connects. The driver never feels confident enough to push the final limit. Meanwhile the Mercedes looks almost effortless. Russell drives aggressively. Very late braking. Heavy front-end load. Antonelli drives more smoothly, more fluid. Yet both drivers reach almost identical lap times. That usually reveals something very important about the car. It has a wide performance window. Cars with narrow windows can be extremely fast, but only in perfect conditions. Cars with wide windows are far more dangerous, because they remain fast in many different situations. Cold track, hot track, new tires, used tires. And right now, the W17 appears to belong to that second category. Which is why the Mercedes front row in China is not just impressive. It might be a warning. A warning that the 2026 championship could already have a clear leader. Still, qualifying is only part of the story. The race tomorrow will bring completely different challenges. Heavy fuel loads, long tire stints, strategic battles. And Shanghai is famous for producing long DRS trains that can completely change the order. Starting 8th and 9th, Verstappen and Hadjar will have work to do. But if Red Bull manages to stabilize the car for race conditions, points are still possible. Even a finish inside the top 6 would limit the damage. But the bigger question goes far beyond the Chinese Grand Prix. Because what Verstappen revealed today is not just frustration. It is a warning sign. A sign that Red Bull may be starting the new regulation era from behind. And if Mercedes really has unlocked the secret of these new cars, then Antonelli's pole lap in Shanghai might be remembered as the moment the balance of power in Formula One changed again. But there is another detail from qualifying that makes this situation even more dramatic. Because when engineers began comparing the telemetry from Antonelli's pole lap with Verstappen's fastest lap, they discovered something even more surprising. The gap was not only on the straight. It started much earlier. In the braking zones. Watch how the Mercedes enters the corners in Shanghai. Turn 1. Turn 6. The final corner before the long straight. Russell and Antonelli brake incredibly late. But more importantly, they keep braking deeper into the corner. The braking phase continues even as the car begins to rotate. That detail may sound small, but under the new regulations, it changes everything. Because braking is now one of the main ways to recover electrical energy. Every extra moment on the brakes allows the energy system to harvest more power. More harvested energy means more deployment later in the lap. And the Mercedes seems perfectly designed for that system. The car remains stable even when the drivers carry braking deep into the corner. The front tires keep their grip. The rear remains planted, which allows the driver to extend the braking phase without losing control. That means more energy recovered every single corner. And over the course of a lap, that advantage becomes enormous. By the time the Mercedes reaches the final straight, it simply has more energy available. More energy means stronger acceleration, more top speed, more performance where it matters most. This is exactly what we saw on Antonelli's pole lap. The car exits the final corner cleanly. Then the power delivery begins. At first the difference is small. But halfway down the straight, the Mercedes keeps accelerating, while other cars begin to fade. That is when the gap opens dramatically. And that is exactly the moment Verstappen noticed when he compared the data. Because the RB22 cannot follow that same pattern. The car struggles under braking. The rear becomes unstable, which forces Verstappen to release the brakes earlier. Less braking time means less energy recovery. Less energy means weaker deployment on the straight. And suddenly the performance gap multiplies. Corner after corner. Lap after lap. That is why the difference in qualifying looked so extreme. Antonelli on pole. Russell second. Ferrari close behind. And Red Bull fighting just to stay inside the top 10. Verstappen 8th. Hadjar 9th. For a team that dominated Formula One not long ago, that result is almost unthinkable. But inside the paddock, engineers know something important. Early seasons under new regulations often create huge gaps between teams. The teams that understand the rules first gain a massive advantage. And right now, Mercedes appears to be that team. Their car is fast.